An issue that is sparking debate about the limit of freedom of expression on social media. It's a pretty familiar debate to most of us. Some of the world's biggest tech companies, including Facebook and YouTube, have banned the work of radio host Alex Jones. His InfoWars has spread conspiracy theories and falsehoods, claiming, among other things, that the Sandy Hook deadly shooting was a hoax, and accusing former President Barack Obama of heading al-Qaeda.
But Twitter has taken a different approach, with CEO Jack Dorsey tweeting today, "We didn't suspend Alex Jones or InfoWars yesterday." We know that's hard for many, but the reason is simple. He hasn't violated our rules. We'll enforce if he does. And we'll continue to promote a healthy conversational environment by ensuring tweets aren't artificially amplified. So is this a question of censorship or just good business practices?
Or both.
Or both. Well, joining us from Washington is market analyst Ebong Eka. But first, let's start in the studio with our Asher Westropp-Evans. And Asher, just let's look at, there's been a few of the major tech companies have had to deal with this issue. How have they responded?
Yeah, absolutely right. And if we take a look at some of the statements released by these major tech companies, we're talking Facebook, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, they all have a pervasive theme through them, which is the violation of standards, often community standards they call them, which are the part of the user agreements that people agree to when they sign up. All these companies have clauses dealing with hate speech or malicious speech, and that's what these companies abided by in unison in a sort of domino effect starting late last week with Spotify. Twitter, however, bucked this trend, as they say in their standards. While they have these similar standards, they say context is key, and they don't quite believe that this fell into the appropriate context.
Ebong, so is context key? Is Twitter right to say, listen, this did not, it's black and white, this didn't violate our terms of service?
Absolutely agree with that. I agree with Jack Dorsey's statement, as well as what he's doing at Twitter with regards to Alex Jones. You may not like what he's saying. Look, I'm not saying I agree with anything that he says, but he has the right to be able to say it. He's not saying anything that's necessarily hateful in this particular case, even though we may think it's unconscionable and ridiculous.
Well, let's take a look, Asher. Ebong says not necessarily hateful. What exactly has Alex Jones been saying?
Alex Jones has said some very large array of conspiracy theories. Some of the most dangerous and pervasive, however, that come through. We can take a look here at some of the particular ones that have caused tangible harm to certain individuals. So we've got the 2012 Sandy Hook elementary school shooting. He's called that a false flag operation, a government operation that was faked. He referenced that Hillary Clinton is running a child sex ring out of a D.C. area pizza restaurant, which led to a man going into this particular restaurant with an AR-15 rifle. He's constantly referred to the U.S. government being behind terror and lone gunman operations, including 9/11. And he says, also one of his more wacky ones, that the U.S. government controls the weather with a weather weapon. Now, all these do have tangible impacts that have caused harms that certain organizations are now saying are unconscionable.
Ebong, well, we're talking about a time when all of these social networks are really dealing with a major challenge of fighting fake news, impacting elections, certainly, as we know. This could fall into that category, arguably, as well. Some of the things he said having very real, as Asher mentioned, and violent consequences. So how should they deal with it in that case when you see those kind of a chain of effect?
That leading to harm doesn't necessarily make it hateful. So you may disagree. He may say, you know, that Clinton's running a child sex ring and some nutcase shows up here in D.C. with an AR-15 to threaten people. That person was nutty anyways. They're looking for something to give him a reason to become a lot more nutty in public. So as it relates to standards across the board of social media platforms, the mistake that we're all making is that we think that these companies like Facebook and Google and YouTube are all democracies. They're not. They're run by a few people who make decisions across the board. And what they do is they'll follow the wisdom of quote unquote, the crowd. So if the crowd of the whole crowd says this is bad, this is hateful, and then these platforms will act accordingly. But you may not agree or like what he's saying, but if he's saying something that's inciting violence, that's a different story. Now, he can say something like, he may say something like Clinton's responsible for a child sex ring, yada, 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 but never once did he say, you should go approach this pizza place with a gun and try and take the law into your own hands. Again, I'm not defending him. What I am saying is you want to give a voice to people who aren't necessarily inciting hateful behavior and violence. They may say something that's contrary and even in many cases ridiculous. But again, that's how we were able to have these discussions and have an opportunity to refute them.
Well, let me ask you, Asher, why do you think perhaps Twitter made this decision, despite the fact that Facebook and YouTube, looking basically at the same material, decided the other way and said, no, this is a problem and could be a problem for our business?
Well, look, Kalev, I would like to be the eternal optimist and say this was about free speech and access to free speech.
About altruism.
Altruism and the free rights of man. But honestly, I think that it has a lot more to do with Twitter's business model. Twitter has been much maligned, particularly by the conservative sphere of American politics, for supposedly having a bias against conservatives. There's been all sorts of talk of banning of certain accounts, of shadow banning, of all sorts of activities that Twitter has been accused of. And they've been accused of this particularly because they're not clear in their practices for what they allow, what they ban, and what they're doing behind the scenes. And to go and ban Alex Jones in such a public forum may have just further exacerbated that, and that's something that came out in Dorsey's comments.
Ebong, bigger picture when we're talking about these companies that wield so much power that, as I mentioned earlier, are dealing with requests to handle fake news, to help make their platforms a place for positive, useful, free discussion and not otherwise. Given the bottom line, given that we know, as you say, ultimately they're looking out for their own interests, do you think that we can reasonably rely on any of these companies to do that, to take those kinds of actions, or is that just sort of fantasy?
It's fantasy. I mean, it's our responsibility, everybody's responsibility to find news and information that actually gives them something of value. So people in general will look for something to either confirm their beliefs or to counter their beliefs to get real information. And majority of people you're seeing now within the last 10 years, I'd say, are trying to find information to confirm what they already believe. They're not looking for contrary opinions or contrary views. Majority of the networks here in this country are just like that. You can tell by how they're run. They're now becoming more opinion more than it is technically news. So here's another point I want to add to that. Twitter has Asher mentioned earlier that Twitter's business model is different. That's correct. The medium is different. So Twitter doesn't necessarily rely heavily on video, unlike YouTube and Facebook, which is very heavily video driven. So you have a lot more impact from a video perspective than you would from text on Twitter. So I think that's another thing that Jack Dorsey, as well as the people at Twitter, were looking at as it relates to banning Alex Jones or not. Because if you're on Twitter, you can see all the ridiculous things people are saying. There are a lot of crazy people on Twitter. I see it all the time.
All right, Ebong Eka and our Asher Westropp-Evans, we have to stop here.